Hi, my name's Chris Hobbs. I'm a retired Metropolitan Police Officer. I served for 32 years in London. In the 1980s I was heavily involved in policing football. In the 1990s I spent a lot of time in Southall with the Asian community during periods of quite high tension in the town. They didn't forget me because after I retired I was presented with a ceremonial sword by the country's biggest Sikh temple. From 2000 I became involved in Operation Trident. I worked extensively at the airports, and as issues involving drug trafficking and violence became a problem, I then spent a total of 18 months over an 8-year period working in Jamaica, at Jamaican airports. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. I grew to love the country and love the people in it. We set up a small Jamaican children's charity that's still going and helps keep some of the poorest Jamaican children from Kingston in education. So all in all, it's been a fascinating 32-year career, and I'd just like to share really some thoughts that I have on the current issues that are plaguing London and indeed the country in terms of violent crime, knife crime, gang crime. It really was a privilege to have been involved in Operation Trident. It began, for those of you who aren't aware, back in the 90s, where there was a real problem in London involving violent crime, gun crime. This tended to revolve around a group of gangsters that became known as Yardies. Yardies was a term that was and still is used out in Jamaica. And what happened was that Yardie criminals from Jamaica were coming into London and engaging in some really violent crimes as they were trying to establish their drugs business. Now, this led to demands, quite rightly, from the black community that the police should do more. So Operation Trident in 1998 was founded, and its aim was really to dedicate itself to the black community and to those problems that the community demanded be solved, be sorted. In 2000, Operation Trident became fully operational, so it had teams of officers that would investigate murders and investigate shootings. But really there was more to it than that. What Trident wanted to become, and I think successfully became, was a trusted brand within the black community, that the black community could trust Trident. And what I saw, and was very privileged to see, was this trust build up between a unit of the Metropolitan Police and the black community, where, let's be honest, there's been over decades and still is tension and some mistrust. But Trident was a really successful brand name. When I was out in Jamaica, Jamaican police officers would almost snatch your arm off because they wanted to wear a Trident lanyard. Everyone I spoke to in Jamaica knew of Operation Trident. But more important, it was successful. It took gunmen off the streets. It arrested gunmen, it locked up gunmen, and as a result the community found a degree of peace. So Trident really was synonymous with policing that could be trusted. And I think what we all wanted was for this to expand from Trident throughout the whole of the Met. So you would have a firm partnership between the Metropolitan Police and the black community. Unfortunately, perhaps, it didn't quite work out as planned. I think what happened really was that Trident became a victim of its own success. Senior officers came and went, most of them were extremely good. But someone somewhere at Scotland Yard decided that Trident wouldn't just deal with the black community, it would deal with all gun crime. It would try and take guns off the streets, and that became its primary objective. My view, and it's a personal view, one that probably the Met wouldn't agree with, but my view was that Trident, perhaps with its change of senior management, rather lost focus on the black community, became more concerned with taking guns off the streets. And unfortunately, of course, then we had the death of Mark Duggan, and really Trident is still a very successful unit. It deals with gang crime, it deals well with gang crime, it is a unit to be trusted, but that relationship that was there and which I saw and was proud to be a part of really tended to dissipate over the years, which was very, very unfortunate. Yeah, there's no doubt that the death of Mark Duggan in 2011 really did cause a crisis of confidence between the police and sections of the black community. We all remember the riots of 2011, the looting that went on and the violence, and the fact that after the riots police made lots of arrests, and there was concern that a number of gangs from across London became involved in the rioting. And after that we had people facing trials, and we also had in 2010, a year before the riots, a change of government. With the change of government came some dramatic changes to policing. And really, from my point of view, it all conspired to a certain extent to bring about the problems that we see today. People were arrested after the riots. The gangs really were sat upon, for want of a better expression. And I know some people will disagree, but gangs were and are an issue. But then we had cutbacks. What should have happened, and what I would like to have seen happen, was that strong relationship that existed between Trident and the community built on. But the reverse happened. Community policing across the Met suffered because of cuts. We saw safer neighbourhood teams that really had built up a good relationship in some of these socially deprived areas. They were cut. They virtually were wiped out. Theoretically they existed, in practice they didn't. Police stations were closed. Police stations in areas, again, where you had a problem with gangs, you had a problem with violence, you had a problem with employment, you had a problem with deprivation, you had a problem with schooling, and then you shut the police station. Where was the logic in that? But the Met really didn't have a lot of choice. And then, of course, we've had this increase of violence. Now, I'll be a little controversial here. Many police officers, myself included, would say that criticism of police stop and search has added to the problem of knife crime and violent crime. I know a lot of people will disagree with me, but that's my view. Criticisms by the Prime Minister, who was then Home Secretary, Theresa May, meant that police officers drastically reduced their stop and search. The proportion of successful stop and searches where something was found increased. But within the Met, there were 1,000 less arrests per month as a result of stop and search. You also had, as we know, the rise of social media. Some people won't agree. We had gangs publicising themselves on social media, criticising each other, daring each other, being very antagonistic towards each other, provoking each other. And part of that resulted in an increase in knife crime. And yes, I accept some people will carry knives for their own protection. They're not in gangs, but they're frightened when they step out on the street. I was born and raised in Hackney. It was a rough place then, but we didn't have to worry about gangs. We didn't have to worry about stabbings, knives, guns. But of course, if you're a youngster there in some of these inner city deprived areas, you have to worry about all these things when you step out the door, and that surely can't be right. So we've seen, haven't we, an increase in violent crime. We've now seen police doing increasing amounts of stop and search, controversially. Some of you won't like that, some of you will disapprove, but they have taken hundreds of knives off the streets. Each knife taken, surely, off the streets as a result of stop and search must be potentially a lifesaver. So the police are working very, very hard. Police also do get a little upset at being called racist, a term that I was engaged with recently with an activist. Perhaps he's got the best of motives, but he kept using the term racist pigs. But these racist pigs, when they get called to a knife incident, they don't know what they're going to face when they get there. They do not know whether they're going to have to face someone armed with a knife. They do not know when they get there whether they're going to have to be frantically trying to save that person's life, very often a young person. And when they get there, they do their best, not always successfully, but they try and save lives. And there's some really horrendous, heart-rending footage of police officers trying to save lives of young men who've been stabbed or shot on the streets of London. So we really do have a major issue. Stop and search isn't the total answer. You can't police your way out of this problem. No police officer would say you can. But look at what else has gone wrong. Policing has been cut. As I said before, community policing has been suffered. You haven't got those officers on the estates who get to know people, get to know them by their first names, who help out with activities, with sporting activities. I can remember talking to Sheldon Thomas, who many of you will know, and he was telling me about on his estate in the 70s, one home beat officer who knew everything that was going on. And if there was trouble looming, this officer would find out about it and quietly nip it in the bud. That's the sort of policing really that we want to see back on our streets. But as it is, we've got hard-pressed officers racing from knife crime to knife crime, from stabbing to stabbing. When I was a young PC, I think I went to about 2 stabbings in my 4 or 5 years I spent in uniform. 2. Now, for some officers, it's a regular occurrence. And for some officers, especially those who lose the battle to save a life, I know it is heartrending. It's heartrending, and it's something they will never forget for the rest of their lives. But it's not just policing, is it? As I just said, you can't police your way out of this problem. There are other issues. The cuts, social service cuts, youth club cuts, special education department cuts, mental health provision for young people cuts, problems in finding jobs, problems with accommodation, housing. Many of these areas now, Hackney for example, where I used to live, have become quite gentrified. So you really have got the have-nots and the haves, and the have-nots seeing what the haves do have. And that's no excuse, of course, is it, for criminality, stabbing, robbery, etc., etc. And you also have, don't you, within these areas, people who are doing a fantastic job within those communities, steering people away from gangs and from knife crime. We don't hear much about them, do we? We tend to hear very much more from those who are very loud, who shout the loudest, who are very critical, sometimes with justification. But we don't hear too much from those who are working quietly in the background, the real heroes, to steer people away from violent crime. And they really do a quite remarkable job, and probably we should hear more from them. Maybe a little bit less from those who are constant in their criticism of police and some politicians. Although with politicians, sometimes you have to say they do deserve criticism. Where is the way forward? Well, we must provide better opportunities for youngsters. There's no two ways about that. I think if we're talking about the black community, people within the black community have acknowledged they probably must do more themselves, in addition to the fantastic work that's being done. I can remember a speech by one black activist who I won't name, but doesn't think very much of police, but it was a brilliant speech back in 2015, where he pointed out the tremendous toll of black youngsters who've died, and where he called upon the black community to do more in terms of dealing with its youngsters, in dealing with violence, in dealing with drug crime. It was an impassioned speech, and one that I will remember forever. And this is an activist really who is most of the time extremely critical of police officers, but in that speech he was absolutely spot on. So where do we go from here? Well, we've got, dare I use the B word, Brexit looming. We don't quite know how that's going to work out in terms of our economy, whether the have-nots will be even worse off. The government really must address the issues that have created a continuation of this problem. Remember, back in the 90s, the early part of this millennium, we had, as I said, Trident working extremely hard to deal with gangs and violence, and they did it successfully. But unfortunately, the problem has risen again. Some of the gangs have never gone away. Some of the gangs have been going for 20 years. They're extremely well established. And they are at the root of some of the problems that we see. But there has to be a total rethink. I'm not sure that task forces, be they police task forces or the mayors, are the answer. The answer is people who know what they're doing, more money, more resources, open up the youth clubs, open up the special education centres, get mental health provision there the way it should be, get everything back the way we need it to be to stop the carnage on our streets. Our politicians really must get their fingers out and stop thinking about themselves. Well, you've heard me out, you've heard my views on the situation. I'm curious to know as to what your views are. So if you do have views, comments on what I've said, preferably non-abusive ones, perhaps you'd like to place them on the site so we can all have a good look at them, and it'll all be part really of this constructive dialogue that we so desperately need at the moment if we really are going to make an impact in respect of this problem of violent crime. So all comments, non-abusive comments, but all comments more than welcome. Thanks a lot.